Little House on the Prairie may have redefined the family drama, but behind the warm smiles and wholesome lessons was a cast marked by heartbreak, silence, and tragedy that would follow them for decades. Fame did not save them. In fact, for some, it became the very force that pushed them toward endings darker than anything the Ingalls family ever faced on screen. Nearly 43 years after the series concluded, their stories remain so haunting that once you hear them, you'll never watch this beloved classic the same way again. The Prairie may have represented hope and resilience on television, but for those who brought Walnut Grove to life, reality was often cruel, unforgiving, and tragically far from the happy endings their characters received. What happened when the camera stopped rolling reveals a devastating truth about the cost of childhood fame, the relentless grip of addiction, and the brutal indifference of an industry that consumes its own. Michael Landon, Charles Anthony Ingalls. Michael Landon was born Eugene Maurice Orowitz on October 30, 1936 in Forest Hills, New York. He was 37 years old when he not only stepped into the role of Charles Ingalls, the strong and compassionate patriarch of the Ingalls family, but also became the creative force behind the entire series as its producer, writer, and director. By the time Little House on the Prairie premiered, Landon was already a household name from his 14-year run on Bonanza. Yet he was determined to create something more meaningful, something that would speak to American families in ways television rarely attempted. But behind the warmth he projected on screen, Landon carried the weight of a traumatic childhood that haunted him throughout his life. His mother had attempted suicide in front of him when he was young, an experience that left psychological scars he never fully healed from. Throughout his years on Little House, Landon became known for his perfectionism and controlling nature on set, demanding impossibly long hours from his cast and crew, often working himself to exhaustion in what many saw as an attempt to outrun his demons. His personal life became increasingly complicated as his marriages crumbled under the pressure of his workaholic tendencies and infidelities. He divorced his second wife, Lynn Noe, in 1982, devastating their children and sending shockwaves through the tight-knit cast who had watched the marriage disintegrate over years of filming. As the years passed after Little House ended in 1983, Landon continued working relentlessly, creating and starring in Highway to Heaven, and later beginning work on another series. Yet his body was betraying him in ways he couldn't control through sheer willpower. In April 1991, Landon began experiencing severe abdominal pain. What he discovered would shock the nation. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and deadly forms of the disease. The man who had played the invincible father figure to millions was suddenly facing his own mortality, and the prognosis was devastating. Despite his fame, wealth, and determination, there was nothing that could be done. Michael Landon died on July 1, 1991 at the age of 54 from pancreatic cancer, just 3 months after his diagnosis. A man who had spent decades portraying strength, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit was taken swiftly and mercilessly by a disease that showed him no mercy. The cruel irony was inescapable. Charles Ingalls had overcome every hardship the Prairie threw at him, but Michael Landon couldn't overcome the one battle that truly mattered. Melissa Sue Anderson, Mary Ingalls. Melissa Sue Anderson was born on September 26, 1962, in Berkeley, California. She was 11 years old when she stepped into the role of Mary Ingalls, the eldest daughter whose gradual loss of sight became one of the series' most heartbreaking storylines. Anderson had already begun working in Hollywood as a child, appearing in commercials and guest spots. But Little House on the Prairie would define her career and in many ways trap her in an identity she struggled to escape. Yet beneath the surface of her success, Anderson felt increasingly isolated on set. She later revealed in interviews in her memoir that she never felt truly accepted by her fellow cast members, particularly Melissa Gilbert, who played her younger sister Laura. The competitive tension between the two young actresses was palpable, and as the years progressed, Anderson found herself emotionally withdrawn and lonely, despite being surrounded by what appeared to be a television family. The pressure of carrying such emotionally demanding storylines as a teenager, particularly Mary's blindness arc, took a psychological toll that few recognized at the time. She was expected to deliver devastating performances week after week while navigating the normal challenges of adolescence, all under the intense scrutiny of millions of viewers, and a demanding production schedule. As the years passed after she left the show in 1981, Anderson's career never reached the heights many expected. She struggled to find roles that weren't simply variations of Mary Ingalls, and Hollywood seemed uninterested in seeing her as anything but the blind girl from the prairie. Through the 1980s and 1990s, her work became increasingly sparse, limited to occasional television movies and guest appearances that felt more like reminders of past glory than legitimate career opportunities. The industry that had celebrated her as a child offered little to her as an adult, and she eventually moved to Canada with her husband, effectively stepping away from the business that had defined her youth. The isolation she felt on set as a child had become the isolation of being forgotten by an industry that moves on without sentiment or loyalty. Melissa Sue Anderson is still alive today at 63 years old, but her story remains one of profound loss. Not death, but the death of what could have been. A talented actress who gave some of the series' most memorable performances found herself cast aside, living quietly away from the spotlight that once defined her. A tragic fate for someone who had once been one of television's most beloved young stars. Karen Grassel, Caroline Ingalls. Karen Grassel was born on February 25, 1942 in Berkeley, California. She was 31 years old when she stepped into the role of Caroline Ingalls, the patient and loving mother who served as the moral center of the Ingalls family. Grassel was a classically trained actress with a background in theater, having studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, and she initially viewed Little House on the Prairie as a stepping stone in what she hoped would be a distinguished career-spanning stage and screen. But behind the serene maternal image she projected, Grassel was fighting bitter battles that would leave lasting scars. Her relationship with Michael Landon deteriorated rapidly during the series' run, particularly when she discovered the massive disparity between her salary and Landon's earnings despite her being second-billed. When she attempted to negotiate for fair compensation, Landon responded with hostility and vindictiveness, even publicly humiliating her during contract disputes. The psychological toll of being undervalued and mistreated by someone she worked with daily was compounded by her personal struggles. Her marriage was falling apart, and she was privately battling alcoholism that intensified as the years on the show progressed. The woman who played the steadfast mother was drowning in addiction and despair, showing up to set carrying wounds no one could see. As the years passed after Little House ended in 1983, Grassel found herself typecast and struggling to find work that matched her training and talent. Through the 1980s and 1990s, she took whatever roles came her way, but the opportunities were few and often demeaning, a far cry from the distinguished career she had envisioned. Her alcoholism worsened, spiraling into a darkness that nearly destroyed her completely. She has spoken candidly in later years about hitting rock bottom, about the desperate loneliness of addiction, and about finally seeking treatment in the 1990s. The battle to reclaim her life from alcoholism was long and painful, marked by relapses and the constant weight of regret for the years lost to the disease. Karen Grassel is still alive today at 83 years old, sober and reflective. But the price she paid for her years in the spotlight remains evident. She never achieved the career she dreamed of, never escaped the shadow of Caroline Ingalls, and spent decades fighting an addiction born partly from the pain of being diminished and undervalued. The cruel twist is unmistakable. She played the perfect mother but felt like a failure in her own life. A bittersweet, devastating reality for someone who gave so much to the role. Victor French, Isaiah Edwards. Victor French was born on December 4, 1934 in Santa Barbara, California. He was 39 years old when he stepped into the role of Isaiah Edwards, the gruff but lovable mountain man who became one of the most beloved characters on Little House on the Prairie. French had already worked extensively in television westerns, and his collaboration with Michael Landon on Bonanza had established a friendship and professional partnership that would define both their careers. Yet beneath his larger-than-life presence, French was battling demons that would ultimately destroy him. He was a heavy smoker, consuming multiple packs of cigarettes daily throughout his adult life, and his drinking was legendary among those who knew him. The character of Isaiah Edwards was written as a reformed alcoholic, an irony not lost on those who watch French struggle with his own relationship with alcohol. Off-screen. During the show's run and afterward, French's health began deteriorating in ways that alarmed his friends and family. He developed a persistent cough that he dismissed with dark humor, and his appearance began showing the ravages of decades of abuse, his face growing more haggard, his voice rougher, his energy diminishing despite his attempts to maintain his characteristic enthusiasm. As the years passed after Little House ended, French continued working with Landon on Highway to Heaven, but his health was failing rapidly. Through the late 1980s, the signs became impossible to ignore: weight loss, chronic fatigue, a cough that never subsided. When he was finally diagnosed with lung cancer in 1989, it was already advanced, having spread aggressively throughout his body. The disease moved with devastating speed, and despite treatment attempts, there was little hope. French faced his final months with the same rough dignity he had brought to his roles, but the suffering was immense and the ending inevitable. Victor French died on June 15, 1989, at the age of 54 from lung cancer, just 2 years before his friend Michael Landon would succumb to his own cancer. A man who had brought joy and warmth to millions through his performances had literally consumed himself to death through cigarettes and alcohol, unable to escape the addictions that marked so many in his profession. The tragic irony was cruel. Isaiah Edwards had overcome his demons on screen, but Victor French never could. Matthew Laborteaux, Albert Ingalls. Matthew Laborteaux was born on December 8, 1966, in Los Angeles, California. He was 12 years old when he stepped into the role of Albert Ingalls, the street-smart orphan adopted by the Ingalls family who quickly became central to the show's later seasons. Laborteaux had been adopted himself as a child, and he brought a raw authenticity to the role that resonated deeply with audiences, particularly during Albert's devastating storylines involving addiction and terminal illness. But behind the compelling performances, Laborteaux was navigating the complicated reality of childhood fame while dealing with learning disabilities that had affected him since early childhood. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, though it wasn't widely discussed at the time, and the pressure of maintaining a successful acting career while managing these challenges created an internal struggle few understood. As Albert's storylines grew darker, including a morphine addiction arc that was groundbreaking for family television, Laborteaux was essentially playing out narratives of destruction and desperation at an age when most children are still figuring out who they are. The psychological impact of repeatedly performing such traumatic material as a young teenager, combined with the uncertainty about his character's fate when the show ended, left lasting marks. As the years passed after Little House concluded, Laborteaux found himself in the familiar trap of the former child star. Too associated with one role to be taken seriously for others, too young to have developed a sustainable career strategy. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, his acting work became sporadic, limited mostly to voice acting in animated series, which, while consistent, was a far cry from the prominence he had enjoyed. The transition into adulthood was difficult, marked by the quiet realization that his moment in the spotlight had passed and would likely never return. Unlike some of his co-stars who could point to tragic external circumstances, Laborteaux's struggle was more subtle. The slow fade into obscurity, the gradual understanding that Hollywood had moved on. Matthew Laborteaux is still alive today at 59 years old, working primarily in voice acting and living largely outside the public eye. While his story doesn't end in physical death, it carries the tragedy of potential unfulfilled. A remarkably talented young actor whose career peaked in his teens and who spent the decades since living in the shadow of a character who died of illness on screen. A haunting parallel to a career that withered away. The cruel reality remains that the industry rarely makes space for former child stars to evolve, leaving them frozen in time in the public consciousness. Charlotte Stewart, Eva Beadle. Charlotte Stewart was born on February 27, 1941, in Yuba City, California. She was 33 years old when she stepped into the role of Eva Beadle, the kind school teacher of Walnut Grove who represented education, patience, and gentle authority throughout the series' early seasons. Stewart was a character actress who had worked steadily in film and television, including a memorable role in David Lynch's Eraserhead, and she brought warmth and authenticity to Miss Beadle that made her a favorite among fans. Yet beneath the cheerful exterior, Stewart's life would be marked by a battle far more terrifying than anything her character faced in the one-room schoolhouse. Years after Little House ended, in the mid-1990s, Stewart began experiencing troubling symptoms: fatigue, unusual sensations, problems that doctors initially dismissed or misdiagnosed. When the truth finally emerged, it was devastating. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer, an aggressive form that had already progressed significantly. The disease tore through her life with the same ruthlessness it showed countless women, requiring brutal rounds of chemotherapy, radiation, and eventually a double mastectomy that left her physically and emotionally scarred. The treatment was as destructive as the disease itself, leaving her weakened, financially drained, and facing an uncertain future. As the years passed through her treatment and recovery, Stewart discovered the harsh reality facing character actors without the financial cushion of leading roles. Medical bills mounted, work opportunities vanished as she fought for survival, and the industry showed little interest in an aging actress recovering from cancer. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, she struggled to rebuild both her health and her career, taking whatever small roles came her way, while dealing with the long-term effects of her treatment. The woman who had taught children their lessons on television had learned the cruelest lesson of all, that illness doesn't discriminate, and the entertainment industry has little patience for those who can't work consistently. Charlotte Stewart is still alive today at 83 years old, having survived cancer but carrying the permanent marks of that battle both physically and emotionally. While she eventually returned to acting in small roles and became an advocate for cancer awareness, her story remains tragic in its revelation of vulnerability. A beloved character actress who faced a deadly disease largely alone, without the resources or support systems that major stars might access. The haunting irony persists. Miss Beadle taught generations of children on screen, but her own education in suffering came at a price that nearly claimed her life. Kevin Hagen, Dr. Hiram Baker. Kevin Hagen was born on April 3, 1928, in Chicago, Illinois. He was 46 years old when he stepped into the role of Dr. Hiram Baker, the dedicated physician of Walnut Grove, who tended to the community's medical crises with wisdom and compassion throughout the series' entire run. Hagen was an experienced character actor with extensive television credits, and his portrayal of the frontier doctor became one of the show's most reliable and comforting presences, representing healing and hope in a harsh environment. But behind the image of the capable healer, Hagen was facing the gradual betrayal of his own body in ways that would grow increasingly cruel as the years progressed. He had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer in the mid-1990s, a particularly aggressive and painful form of the disease that attacks the throat and makes even basic functions like eating and speaking excruciating ordeals. The man who had played a doctor for nearly a decade found himself helpless against a disease that offered no mercy and few treatment options. The cancer ravaged him slowly, each day bringing new limitations and fresh suffering as his body systematically failed him. The treatments available at the time were primitive compared to modern standards, offering more torture than hope. And Hagen faced the devastating reality that the same medical profession he had portrayed with such dignity had no answers for him. As the years passed through his illness, Hagen's condition deteriorated with heartbreaking consistency. Through the late 1990s, he became increasingly isolated, unable to work, struggling with the basic acts of living as the cancer consumed him from within. The disease didn't kill him quickly. Instead, it took its time, stripping away his quality of life piece by piece, leaving him to suffer through an extended decline that robbed him of the dignity he had always maintained. Friends watched helplessly as the vibrant actor they had known became a shadow of himself, trapped in a body that had become his enemy. Kevin Hagen died on July 9, 2005, at the age of 77 from esophageal cancer, but the disease had effectively killed him years before, leaving only suffering in its wake. The cruel irony was devastating. Dr. Baker had saved countless lives on Little House on the Prairie, healing injuries and illnesses with frontier medicine. But Kevin Hagen couldn't save himself, despite all the advances of modern medicine. A man who represented hope and healing died slowly and painfully from a disease that showed him none of the compassion his character had shown others. A tragic fate that reveals how little comfort past roles provide when facing real mortality. Nearly 43 years later, Little House on the Prairie remains a family drama masterpiece, a touchstone of American television that continues to inspire new generations with its stories of resilience, love, and perseverance. Yet the real lives behind it are far more tragic than any blizzard, crop failure, or illness the Ingalls family ever faced on screen. From Michael Landon's devastating cancer diagnosis to Victor French's slow self-destruction through addiction, from Karen Grassel's battle with alcoholism to Charlotte Stewart's fight for survival against breast cancer, from Melissa Sue Anderson's lonely isolation to Matthew Laborteaux's quiet fade into obscurity, from Kevin Hagen's painful deterioration to the countless smaller heartbreaks that marked the cast's journey, every member carried a story the cameras never captured and the audience never imagined. These were real people who brought comfort to millions while often receiving little comfort themselves, who portrayed resilience while struggling to find it in their own lives, who showed us the power of family while sometimes feeling profoundly alone. The Prairie may have been a place of hope on television, but for those who lived in Walnut Grove, the real world beyond the set was often unforgiving and cruel. Which journey struck you the most? Comment below and don't forget to subscribe as we continue to uncover the forgotten truths behind Hollywood's greatest legends.